The cold wind howled through the empty streets of the city as Maggie Turner sat on the cracked sidewalk, her frail body wrapped in a tattered, faded blanket. Her once vibrant auburn hair had turned grey, now tangled and matted from years of neglect. Maggie, a woman in her late 60s, had become just another forgotten soul, blending into the background of the bustling city life that passed her by. She sat alone in the shadow of a tall building near a small, neglected park. It was the corner of 8th and Oak, a busy intersection where people hurried by without a second glance at her. They were too preoccupied with their own lives to spare any attention for a woman like her, someone who had been lost to time, discarded by society. For Maggie, the world outside had become a blur. Days and nights blended together, an endless cycle of survival. She had no home, no family, no one who cared. Her belongings, few and pitiful, were shoved into a plastic bag that lay beside her. The bag contained the remnants of her life, a few worn-out clothes, a half-eaten sandwich, and a small, frayed photograph of her children, Rachel and Daniel, from years ago. Maggie hadn't seen them in over a decade. Her heart ached as she thought about them. Rachel had been the first to distance herself when Maggie's life had fallen apart, and Daniel had followed suit, as most children of broken families did. She had made mistakes, yes, but at the time she had believed she was doing the right thing. And yet, in the end, it hadn't mattered. The pain was a constant companion, gnawing at her insides as she sat in the cold. Her back ached, her hands were stiff with arthritis, and the hunger that had become so familiar never quite disappeared. She glanced at the small, flickering light of a nearby convenience store, its window offering a faint warmth she could never quite reach. Sometimes she would sit there, watching the people come and go, wishing for a fleeting moment that someone would offer her a warm meal, a kind word, or even just a look of recognition. But those moments never came. The only sounds in her world were the distant rumble of traffic, the occasional shout from a passerby, and the relentless ticking of the clock that seemed to mock her in its indifference. Maggie had long since stopped caring about time. It no longer held any meaning. Her life was marked only by the cycles of hunger and exhaustion, the aching loneliness that wrapped around her like a vice. She had once been a woman of some significance, a mother, a wife, a daughter. But now she was nothing more than a shadow of that life, forgotten and abandoned. She remembered a time when she had dreamed of a future, of building a home for her children, of finding peace, of being loved. But those dreams had long since crumbled, buried under the weight of choices she had made and circumstances beyond her control. The sound of footsteps broke her reverie. Maggie glanced up, squinting her tired eyes to see a woman walking toward her. The woman was carrying a small shopping bag, her heels clicking against the pavement with each step. Maggie held her breath for a moment, hoping that this time this stranger might offer her something, just a kind word, a scrap of food, anything. But the woman passed by without a glance, her gaze fixed ahead, as if Maggie didn't even exist. Maggie lowered her head, feeling the sting of rejection. She was used to it, of course. People rarely looked at her, and when they did, it was only with pity or disdain. She had become invisible, an outcast in a world that didn't have room for the likes of her. As the woman disappeared into the distance, Maggie let out a shaky breath. She had once been like them, walking the streets, moving with purpose, her life full of plans and ambitions. But now, all she had was the present moment, and that was often too much to bear. She shifted slightly, trying to get comfortable on the hard concrete. Her body was stiff, and the blanket she used for warmth was barely enough to protect her from the biting chill. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in over a day. The thought of food made her feel sick, yet she knew she would have to find something soon, if not for nourishment, then for survival. Maggie scanned the street, her eyes darting from one place to another. A few people were still walking by, unaware of her presence. Some of them glanced at her, but only briefly. She could feel their gaze, the silent judgment that hung in the air. They didn't understand. They couldn't possibly understand what it was like to lose everything, to be left behind by the people who should have cared the most. Her eyes fell on a nearby trash can. It was overflowing with discarded wrappers and plastic bottles, remnants of others' meals and lives. Maggie sighed. She had grown accustomed to scavenging, searching through trash for something to eat, something to fill the hollow ache inside her. It wasn't dignified, but it was survival. With a grunt, she pushed herself to her feet, the pain in her joints making the movement slow and laborious. She shuffled toward the trash can, carefully pulling aside a few wrappers before reaching in. Her fingers brushed against something soft, leftover bread, half-eaten and soggy from the rain. She hesitated for a moment, staring at it with a mix of hunger and disgust. But in the end, there was no choice. She took the bread, wiped off the dirt, and bit into it, the dry, stale taste filling her mouth. Maggie chewed slowly, barely tasting the food as she forced it down. Her mind wandered again, back to her children, to the family she had once had. Rachel had grown up so fast, so independent, while Daniel had always been the more sensitive one. She had failed them both, and now it was too late to make amends. But in her heart there was a flicker of hope, a small, fragile hope that one day they might find her again. For now, though, Maggie had to survive. She had to keep going, even if the world seemed to have forgotten her. She was still breathing, still alive, and that was something. As the sky began to darken and the lights of the city flickered on, Maggie settled back into her corner, wrapping the thin blanket around her shoulders. She closed her eyes, trying to ignore the cold and the hunger, and let the sounds of the city lull her into an uneasy sleep. Tomorrow she would wake up again, ready to face another day of loneliness. But for now, she allowed herself a brief moment of peace. The world had forgotten her, but Maggie was still here. It was a chilly morning in early autumn when Maggie found herself once again sitting on the same corner of 8th and Oak. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint orange glow over the city. People moved quickly, wrapped in coats and scarves, rushing past without a second glance at the homeless woman who had claimed this spot as her own. Maggie had become a fixture in this part of the city, sitting on the same stretch of sidewalk day after day. She knew the routine by heart. Wake up with the first rays of sunlight, move carefully to avoid the still cold pavement, and wait. Wait for the world to pass her by, hoping for something, anything that could fill the void in her stomach or her heart. Her blanket, once a deep shade of red, had long since faded to a dull grey. It was full of holes, but it was all she had to protect her from the elements. Her back ached from the hours spent sitting in one place, and her legs were stiff from the constant strain. Maggie glanced at the nearby convenience store, its lights still off, and let out a quiet sigh. The store would open soon enough, but for now she was invisible to everyone passing by. As she shifted her weight, trying to find some relief from the cold, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. The sound grew louder until Maggie looked up and saw the familiar figure of Jack Harris, the owner of the small store. Jack had always been an abrasive man, someone who had little patience for her presence outside his business. Maggie had often overheard him grumbling under his breath, muttering complaints to customers about the homeless old woman who seemed to take up space in front of his door. Today, however, Jack's usual grumbling turned into something far more aggressive. His face was red, his eyes narrow with irritation as he approached Maggie. "You again," Jack sneered, his voice sharp. "You're blocking the entrance to my store. Get up and move, now!" Maggie winced at the venom in his voice, but she didn't respond. She had learned long ago that speaking to people like Jack was futile. They had no interest in her story, no empathy for her situation. To them, she was nothing more than a nuisance, an inconvenience they could do without. Slowly, Maggie gathered the strength to rise to her feet, her joints protesting the movement. The world around her swirled, the pain in her back growing worse with each step. She reached for the bundle of belongings beside her, but before she could grab it, Jack's voice cut through the air once again. "I told you to move, not sit there like some lazy bum. You've been hanging around here for weeks. You're ruining the business." Maggie felt the sting of his words, but she kept her head down, shuffling slowly towards the edge of the sidewalk. She was used to being spoken to like this, but each insult still cut deeper than the last. As Maggie reached the edge of the curb, Jack's temper flared. Without warning, he turned toward the back of his shop, where a bucket of hot water sat, steaming from the warmth of the store's kitchen. His frustration reached its boiling point. Without thinking, Jack grabbed the bucket, his anger clouding his judgment, and swung it toward Maggie. The hot water splashed across her, searing her skin in an instant. The pain was unimaginable. Maggie gasped, her body jerking as the scalding water burned through the thin fabric of her clothes and onto her exposed skin. She stumbled backward, collapsing onto the ground in agony. The world around her blurred. The pain was so intense, so all-encompassing, that it felt as if her entire body was on fire. Her legs gave out from under her, and she tumbled to the cold, unforgiving pavement, her vision swimming with tears. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. All she could do was writhe in the searing heat of the burns. People continued to pass by, most of them oblivious to the scene unfolding just a few feet away. A few glanced in her direction, but none stopped to help. No one seemed to care. This was the way of the world for Maggie, pain and suffering met with indifference. But then, amidst the crowd, Maggie heard a voice. It was faint at first, but it grew louder as the woman approached. "Oh my God, are you okay?" a young woman's voice asked, full of concern. Maggie's blurred vision tried to focus as she turned toward the sound. A woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with long brown hair and a worried expression, was kneeling beside her. She was wearing a light jacket and had a bag slung over her shoulder. "I'm fine," Maggie whispered hoarsely, though she knew that wasn't true. The pain was overwhelming, and her body felt like it was melting from the inside out. "No, you're not fine," the woman said firmly, her hands gently touching Maggie's arms, trying to assess the damage. "What happened? That man, did he do this to you?" Maggie didn't answer immediately. She couldn't bring herself to speak about what had just happened. She had been treated as less than human for so long that the thought of speaking up, of confronting someone like Jack, felt impossible. "I'm calling an ambulance," the woman continued, her voice tinged with panic. She pulled out her phone, dialing quickly. "Please, just hang on." As the woman spoke to the emergency operator, Maggie's eyes fluttered closed, the pain making her lightheaded. She felt like she was drifting away, her body slipping into some unknown space where the agony didn't exist. All she could do was hold on, clinging to the small sliver of hope that someone, anyone, might help her. Minutes passed before the ambulance arrived, the sirens cutting through the stillness of the street. The paramedics rushed over, their professional voices and swift movements cutting through the haze of Maggie's mind. They gently lifted her onto a stretcher, carefully applying bandages to her burns, but Maggie barely registered their actions. The only thing she could focus on was the excruciating pain and the cold emptiness that had been her constant companion for so long. As the paramedics loaded Maggie into the ambulance, her body ached in ways she didn't think possible. The hot water had burned her skin, leaving angry, red welts across her arms and legs. Her vision blurred, and she felt detached, as though her body was no longer hers to control. But amidst the pain and the overwhelming exhaustion, there was something different now, a small, fragile thread of something she hadn't felt in years, the possibility of care, of kindness, and of hope. The young woman, Claire she had called herself, had stayed with Maggie until the ambulance arrived. Her soft voice and urgent concern had pierced through the numbness that had surrounded Maggie for so long. It was the first time in years that someone had cared enough to help her, to reach out. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, Maggie felt an unfamiliar warmth inside. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. Maggie woke up in the sterile white room of the hospital. Her head throbbed, and her body felt as though it had been battered by 1,000 stones. The pain from her burns was a constant, searing reminder of the cruelty she had endured. The hospital room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the machines and the distant sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. Maggie felt disoriented, and for a moment she thought she was dreaming, a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Her vision was blurry and she could barely move. The pain in her body was overwhelming, and her limbs felt like lead. She tried to lift her hand but found it too heavy, the weight of her own body making each movement feel like an impossible task. She was lying on a simple hospital bed, surrounded by white sheets that smelled of antiseptic. Maggie could not remember how she had gotten here. The world felt distant, unreal. For a while, Maggie simply lay there, trapped in her own thoughts, unable to understand what was happening. The pain in her skin, the soreness in her muscles, it all seemed to blur together, as if her body no longer belonged to her. She felt hollow, as if life had been drained out of her long ago, leaving only a shell, a body without purpose. Her mind wandered back to the streets, the cold concrete, the harsh words from strangers, the feeling of being invisible. This, she thought, was her fate. This was the life she had been given. But there was something different now, a subtle shift that Maggie couldn't quite place, a presence. A woman, young and kind, was checking on her regularly. The nurse's name was Claire. Maggie could hear the soft footsteps of Claire entering the room, the quiet rustling of her uniform, and the gentle murmur of her voice as she spoke to Maggie. Claire wasn't like the others. She wasn't dismissive or afraid of Maggie. She didn't look at her with pity or disgust. There was something in the way she treated Maggie that felt almost too familiar, like a connection from a life Maggie could barely remember. Each time Claire spoke, Maggie felt a strange sense of comfort that she hadn't known in years. But even so, Maggie found it difficult to trust these fleeting moments of kindness. She wasn't sure if she deserved them. As the days passed, Maggie's physical wounds began to heal, though the burns on her skin remained raw and painful. She spent her time in silence, drifting in and out of sleep. Her mind was heavy with thoughts of the past, of the life she had left behind, and the people she had lost. One afternoon, Claire came into the room with a worried look on her face. Maggie stirred slightly, but the pain in her body was too much to bear, and she fell back into the haze of exhaustion. Claire had been checking her vitals and adjusting her bandages, but this time there was something more. She spoke softly, as if trying to break through the fog in Maggie's mind. "Maggie, I want you to know," Claire said, her voice gentle yet firm. "You're not alone anymore. We're here for you." Maggie didn't respond. She couldn't. But inside, a flicker of something stirred. A thought, a feeling, too faint to hold on to. Could it be that there was still a chance for her? A possibility, however small, that her life could change? She had lived in darkness for so long, and yet, here in the sterile room, surrounded by the hum of machines and the kindness of someone like Claire, Maggie felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The days blurred together in the hospital. Maggie's body, though scarred, was slowly recovering, and the sharp pain from the burns began to fade into a dull ache. Yet the emotional scars, those deep, invisible marks left by years of neglect and loneliness, remained stubbornly etched into her soul. But there was something else now, a shift, a faint stirring of something unfamiliar and almost forgotten: hope. It was during one of her early morning wake-ups that Claire, the young nurse, approached her with an unusual proposition. Claire had been caring for Maggie consistently, and there was a gentleness in her touch that made Maggie feel, for the first time in years, like she mattered. She wasn't just another discarded soul, another body to be fixed and forgotten. "Maggie," Claire said one morning, her voice soft but with a sense of urgency, "I've been doing some research, and I believe there may be a way for you to access your past, your family's history. There's a lawyer who might be able to help you reclaim what's yours." The words barely registered at first. Family, history, past. These words felt foreign, distant. Maggie had long since abandoned any hope of reconnecting with the family she once had. Her children, Rachel and Daniel, were distant memories, faint echoes of a life she couldn't remember clearly anymore. They hadn't contacted her in years. Her marriage to Bill, her husband, had long since ended with his death. And now, after all the years spent on the streets, Maggie had come to accept that there was nothing left for her in the world. But the thought of her old life, the house they had once lived in, the wealth they had enjoyed, began to stir something deep within her. Was there a chance, just a small chance, that her life could turn around? Could she, after all this time, reclaim what had been taken from her? Or perhaps what she had given up willingly? Claire continued, her voice steady. "I can contact Michael Lawson. He was your family's lawyer, wasn't he? He handled all the legal matters after your husband passed. Maybe you still have access to some of it, your estate, your wealth." Maggie's heart raced at the thought. Wealth? Estate? She had long forgotten those things, if she had ever really understood their significance. To her, they had always seemed distant, like stories from another life, one that didn't belong to her anymore. Still, the idea of contacting Michael Lawson, someone from her past, was enough to spark a flicker of curiosity. A single thread of connection to a world she had long abandoned. Claire wasted no time. She made the call to Michael Lawson's office, and Maggie was left to contemplate the possibilities. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, could she leave this hospital and return to a life of comfort, of security? Could she make a fresh start, away from the shadows of her past? Days later, Maggie found herself sitting in a sterile conference room at the hospital, her head wrapped in bandages and her body still recovering. The door opened, and in walked Michael Lawson, a man she hadn't seen in over a decade. He looked older, greying at the temples, but there was a familiarity about him that both comforted and unnerved her. "Maggie," he greeted, his voice heavy with surprise. "I never thought I'd see you again." Maggie nodded, unsure of what to say. She had no words for the man who had once been a part of her life, someone who had handled the death of her husband, Bill, and who had been involved in the management of her family's affairs. But now everything felt so distant, so irrelevant. "Claire tells me you're in need of legal help," Michael continued, sitting down across from her. "I've kept all the records from Bill's estate. Everything is still in your name. The house, the investments, the funds. It's all there." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced to keep up with the implications of his words. Bill's estate? Her estate? She had forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood, the extent of what they had accumulated over the years. Michael looked at her with a mix of concern and curiosity. "It's been a long time, Maggie. Why now? Why reach out after all these years?" Maggie didn't know how to answer. The years on the streets had numbed her, made her forget the person she used to be. Who was she now after all that had happened? What had become of the woman who once had everything? Money, a family, a home? "I don't know," Maggie said finally, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what happened. I was lost. But now I want to find out who I am again." Michael nodded slowly, as if he understood, but Maggie could see the judgment in his eyes. She could feel his uncertainty, his disbelief. She had been absent from her family's life for so long that it was hard to believe someone like her could ever return. But Michael continued, telling her that all the legal matters would be handled, that the house and the remaining assets were still hers, if she wanted them. The possibility of reclaiming her life, her old life, seemed almost too much to bear. Maggie had spent so many years surviving on the streets, fighting to stay alive, that the idea of comfort and security seemed like a dream she had long given up on. But now, with Michael's confirmation that her family's wealth was still intact, Maggie began to realize something. She had a choice. As the days passed, Maggie began to feel something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. Her time in the hospital had been quiet and reflective, but now, with the knowledge that her family's wealth still existed, there was a new energy in her. The possibility of reconnecting with her past, of reclaiming something that had once belonged to her, seemed almost too surreal. Maggie had lived for so long with nothing but the streets to keep her company. The thought of returning to her old life, of living in a house again, of having more than just scraps, felt both thrilling and terrifying. Her body was healing, and with that physical recovery came the space to consider what was left of her former life. The memories of her family, her children, and the life she had lived with Bill resurfaced in fleeting moments. There was a house, a grand house, that she had once called home. It seemed so far removed from the woman she had become, a woman who had been cast aside by the very people she had loved. It was hard to reconcile the image of the wealthy woman she once was with the broken, forgotten figure who now lay in a hospital bed, her future uncertain. Maggie had been given a chance to confront the remnants of her past. There was the house, her former home, that had remained untouched, waiting for her return. It was a place she hadn't stepped foot in for years, and yet it held all the answers to the life she had left behind. The house stood as a monument to everything she had once known, a place of comfort, security, and warmth. But as Maggie lay in her bed, the thought of returning to it was overshadowed by the realization of what that return would mean. She had left the house, not because she had wanted to, but because it had become a place of unbearable grief. After Bill's death, the walls had echoed with silence, and the house had slowly become a prison. Maggie could still remember the day she left, how her mind had been clouded with sorrow, how she had chosen to wander the streets rather than stay and face the void left by her husband's absence. She had abandoned the home, the family, and everything she had once held dear. Now, as she prepared to face that house again, Maggie was filled with a complex mixture of emotions. There was the fear of confronting the past, the shame of having walked away from it all, and the sorrow of realizing how much time had been lost. Yet there was also a flicker of hope. A small voice inside her told her that this was her opportunity to reclaim something she had lost, to rebuild not just her life, but herself. Maggie knew the road ahead would not be easy. There were no guarantees that her children, Rachel and Daniel, would welcome her with open arms. After all, she had been absent for so long, and they had likely moved on with their own lives. They were no longer the young children who had depended on her for everything. They were adults now, and Maggie wondered if they still remembered her, or if she was nothing more than a shadow in their minds, a distant memory of a mother who had failed them. But even so, the thought of seeing them again, of having a chance to make amends, filled Maggie with a quiet determination. She had been broken by life, but she was not beyond redemption. The wealth, the house, and everything that came with it no longer mattered as much as the possibility of reconnecting with the family she had lost. If she could find a way to bridge the gap between them, perhaps she could find a sense of peace. In the weeks that followed, Maggie's physical health continued to improve. She spent more time in the hospital's common areas, occasionally sitting by the window and gazing out at the city below. The world outside felt both familiar and foreign to her. It was a world she had once known, but now everything seemed distant. The noise of the city, the hustle of the people, none of it seemed to touch her anymore. It was as if she had become a part of the scenery, just another passing shadow in a place where no one noticed. Still, there was a growing sense of resolve within her. Maggie knew that her next step was to confront the past. She would return to the house, but more importantly, she would find a way to reconnect with Rachel and Daniel. They were the key to everything. If there was any chance at redemption, it lay with them. One evening, as Maggie sat in the hospital room, her mind wandering over the events that had brought her here, a sudden thought gripped her. Perhaps she could do more than just reconnect with her family. Perhaps she could use the wealth she had inherited, not for herself, but for others. The thought emerged slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it felt right. It felt like something her old self would have done, something her younger, more idealistic self would have believed in. Maggie had been through so much, and she knew the suffering that came with being forgotten, abandoned, and overlooked. There were so many like her, women who had been cast aside by society, by their families, and by life itself. She had seen them on the streets, seen the same hopelessness in their eyes that she had once felt. What if, instead of hoarding the wealth she had, she could use it to help those who were suffering the same fate she had? What if she could make a difference? The idea was not fully formed, but it was a start. A small seed of hope planted in the darkness of her past began to grow. It was a vision of something greater than herself. Maggie had spent years feeling like a burden on the world, but now, for the first time, she saw a way to give back. She wasn't just going to return to the house and reclaim her past. She was going to build a future that would allow her to help others like her. Women who had been forgotten, discarded, and left behind. As Maggie lay in her hospital bed that night, staring out the window at the darkened city, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for years. There was still so much to do, so much to figure out, but for the first time in a long while, Maggie believed that maybe, just maybe, There was a future waiting for her. Maggie stood before the large, weathered house. It had been years since she had last seen it, and though the facade remained the same, it felt foreign to her now. The house that had once been a symbol of her family's prosperity had since fallen into a state of neglect, much like the life she had abandoned. The garden, once manicured and vibrant, was overgrown with weeds. The windows, which had once gleamed with warmth and life, now stood dark and closed, as if shielding themselves from the world. Maggie had not come to the house to relive old memories. She had come to face them, to confront the life she had left behind, and perhaps to start anew. But as she stood on the threshold, her hands trembling slightly, the weight of the past began to sink in. Her children, Rachel and Daniel, had lived here too, in this same house. They had grown up here, surrounded by love and comfort. And yet, in her mind, the echoes of their laughter had long since faded. Maggie's departure had erased any trace of those happier times, leaving behind only the silence of abandonment. The door creaked open slowly, as though it were hesitant to welcome her back. Maggie stepped inside, her footsteps heavy on the wooden floors that had once been filled with the sound of life. She was not the same woman who had left this house all those years ago. The weight of age, of hardship, and of the years spent on the streets had changed her. The woman who had once walked these halls with confidence and purpose was gone, replaced by someone else, someone who was uncertain, fragile, and, at times, fearful. The house felt hollow now, like a museum of her past, each room a relic of a life she had once known. She wandered through the familiar spaces, her fingers brushing against the cold surfaces, each one a reminder of what had been lost. In the living room, the furniture was covered in dusty sheets, the fireplace cold and unused. The photos on the walls, once full of smiles and happiness, now seemed distant and out of place, as though they belonged to someone else entirely. And then there it was, the staircase that led to the bedrooms above. The place where Rachel and Daniel had once played, where they had argued, and where Maggie had tucked them into bed each night. She had been their mother. There had been a time when they had needed her, when they had loved her. But that time was gone now, and Maggie could feel it in the stillness of the house, in the emptiness that seemed to permeate every room. It was time to face them. Rachel and Daniel had agreed to meet with her, though neither seemed enthusiastic about it. It had taken weeks of calls and messages from Claire before they had finally relented. Maggie wasn't sure what to expect from them. She had no illusions that they would welcome her with open arms. Time had passed, and with it, their lives had moved forward without her. She had missed so much, their graduations, their marriages, the births of their children. All of it had happened without her. When they finally arrived, Maggie's heart pounded in her chest. The moment of reckoning had come. As they stepped into the house, their eyes moved over Maggie with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and, if she was honest, resentment. The years of absence had created a chasm between them, and Maggie could feel it in the tension that hung in the air. Rachel, the elder of the two, was the first to speak, though her voice was cold, detached. She barely looked at Maggie as she walked past her, heading for the living room. Daniel followed, his expression unreadable, his eyes cast downward, as though he didn't want to acknowledge her presence. Maggie stood frozen in place, unsure of what to say, unsure if anything she could say would change anything. The years of silence between them had created a barrier that could not easily be broken. They had their own lives now, their own families, and Maggie was just a shadow from the past, someone who had been forgotten and left behind. They didn't want to talk about the past, but neither did they want to completely ignore it. There were too many questions left unanswered, too many wounds left untreated. Rachel's eyes narrowed, and she finally spoke, her voice tight with emotion. "How could you just leave us, Mum?" she asked, her words sharp, cutting through the silence. "We didn't even know if you were alive or dead. You just disappeared. For years, we had no idea where you were." Maggie's heart ached. She had no answer for Rachel's pain, no explanation for the years of absence. What could she say? That she had been too lost, too broken to be there for them, that she had chosen to leave because the grief of losing Bill had been too much to bear? That she had been consumed by her own darkness and had been unable to see beyond it? Rachel's voice trembled with frustration as she continued, "We needed you, Mum. But you weren't there. You were never there." Daniel remained silent, but his eyes, cold, distant, spoke volumes. Maggie could feel the weight of his disappointment pressing down on her. She had failed him, just as she had failed Rachel. There was nothing she could say to make it right. Maggie's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She had already cried too many tears over the years. She had mourned the woman she used to be, the mother she had failed to be. She had mourned the life that had slipped through her fingers like sand. But now she had to face the truth. She had left them. She had abandoned them, and she had no one but herself to blame for the years of pain they had endured. Rachel's words hung in the air, a reminder of the years Maggie had wasted. "Do you even know what it's been like for us, Mum? Do you understand how hard it was to grow up without you?" Maggie closed her eyes, unable to answer. She didn't know what it had been like for them. She had no idea what they had suffered in her absence. All she knew was that they had survived without her, and that, in a way, they were better off for it. They had learned to live without the mother who had once been there for them, and they had grown into adults who no longer needed her. Rachel and Daniel did not want her back. They did not need her in their lives, not now, not after everything that had happened. Maggie realized, with a quiet pang of sorrow, that they had moved on, and she had been left behind in more ways than one. As Maggie sat alone in the house later that evening, her children gone and the door now closed behind them, she was filled with a deep, quiet sadness. She had tried to reconnect, but in the end it had only exposed the painful truth. Her children no longer saw her as their mother. To them she was a stranger, a relic of a past they had long since buried. Maggie had come here seeking redemption, hoping that a reunion would heal the wounds of the past. But what she had found instead was a brutal reality. The bridge between her and her children could not be rebuilt so easily. The pain was too deep, the years too many. They had moved on, and she had been left to face the consequences of her own choices. As the darkness of the evening settled over the house, Maggie understood one thing. No matter how much wealth she had inherited, no matter how many assets she might claim, the true price of her abandonment was something that no amount of money could ever undo. The days following the painful reunion were filled with silence. Maggie's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, each one vying for attention. She had expected the confrontation with Rachel and Daniel to be difficult, but she had never anticipated the weight of their anger, nor the finality of their rejection. For the first time in years, Maggie felt a deep sense of loss, not just of her children, but of herself. She had come to them seeking redemption, and yet all she had received was a mirror, reflecting back the broken pieces of her past. But as the days wore on, something began to shift within Maggie. The sting of rejection, though still raw, started to lose its grip on her. She couldn't afford to dwell in the past any longer. There was something she had to do, something that would give her life meaning again. She had spent so many years on the streets fighting just to survive. But now, with the inheritance she had reclaimed and the lessons she had learned along the way, she had the opportunity to do something truly transformative, not for herself, but for others. Maggie decided to take the next step in her journey. It was time to stop living in the shadow of regret and start living with purpose. With the wealth she had inherited from Bill, Maggie founded a charitable organization, one that would provide support for homeless women, especially elderly women who had been discarded by society. Maggie understood their pain more intimately than anyone else. She knew what it was like to be invisible, to feel the sting of being abandoned, and to suffer in silence. She wanted to create a space where women like her could find solace, help, and most importantly, a second chance. The process was not easy. Maggie had never been involved in running an organization, and she was learning as she went. There were legal hurdles, financial challenges, and the constant reminder that her past was never far behind. But for the first time in years, Maggie felt a sense of control. She was doing something good, something that mattered. Claire, the nurse who had cared for Maggie during her hospital stay, became an invaluable ally in the process. Her compassion and dedication to helping others mirrored Maggie's own, and the two women formed a close bond. Claire helped Maggie set up the foundation, guiding her through the intricacies of non-profit work and connecting her with the right people. Together, they built a team of volunteers and professionals who shared Maggie's vision. Slowly but surely, the foundation began to take shape. Maggie poured herself into the work, finding solace in the faces of the women who came to the organization seeking help. She listened to their stories, offered them advice, and most importantly, she gave them a sense of dignity. Maggie knew what it was like to lose everything, and she was determined to help these women regain their sense of self-worth. As the foundation grew, so did Maggie's sense of fulfillment. She had finally found her calling. The work was hard, and there were days when she felt overwhelmed by the weight of it all, but each small victory, whether it was helping a woman secure a job, find a home, or simply regain her confidence, made it all worthwhile. Despite the progress Maggie had made, there were still moments when the pain of her past crept in. Her children's rejection still stung, and there were days when she found herself yearning for the life she had once shared with them. She wanted so desperately for them to see the woman she had become, to understand that she was more than the woman who had abandoned them. But she also knew that she couldn't force them to forgive her. Forgiveness, she realized, was something that had to come from within them. It was a gift she could not give them, only time could. And so Maggie focused on the present, on the work that was now her life. She found comfort in the women she helped, in the lives she touched, and in the quiet moments of reflection at the end of each long day. She had come to accept that her past could not be rewritten, but she could still shape her future. One evening, after a long day at the foundation, Maggie sat alone in the small office she had set up in one corner of the building. She looked out the window at the setting sun, the city bathed in soft golden light. It had been a while since she had allowed herself to reflect on how far she had come. From the cold streets, to the hospital bed, to the foundation she had built, Maggie realized that she had found a sense of peace she had never thought possible. Though her relationship with Rachel and Daniel remained fractured, Maggie was no longer defined by their rejection. She was no longer the woman who had been lost, forgotten, and abandoned. She had reclaimed her life, and with it, her dignity. She had found her purpose, and that purpose was greater than any material wealth she could ever possess. As the months passed, Maggie's foundation continued to grow, helping more and more women each day. Her work became well known in the community, and she was invited to speak at events, sharing her story and inspiring others with her journey of redemption. Maggie never saw herself as a hero, but to the women whose lives she had changed, she was nothing short of one. But even as her work flourished, there were moments of loneliness. Maggie missed her children. She missed the times when they had been a family, before everything had fallen apart. She knew that the rift between them might never heal, but deep down a part of her held on to the hope that one day they might understand why she had left, and perhaps, just perhaps, there could be forgiveness. One day, out of the blue, she received a letter from Daniel. It was brief, just a few lines, but it was enough to give Maggie hope. He wrote that he had heard about the work she was doing, and he was proud of her. He apologized for the things he had said, and though he admitted he still didn't fully understand everything, he wanted her to know that he was thinking of her. It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a step, a small but significant step in the right direction. Maggie held the letter in her hands, feeling a tear slip down her cheek. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't the reunion she had dreamed of, but it was something, and for that she was grateful. As the sun set on another day, Maggie sat back in her chair, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. Her life was no longer about wealth, status, or what had been lost. It was about the difference she was making in the world, the lives she was touching, and the peace she had finally found within herself. The months that followed Maggie's decision to establish the foundation marked a period of profound transformation. Not only was she rebuilding her own life, but through her work, she was helping to rebuild the lives of others who had been cast aside by society, much like she had been for so long. Maggie had gone from the streets to becoming a beacon of hope for women who had nowhere else to turn. The foundation grew steadily, and Maggie's efforts began to attract attention. Her story, one of loss and redemption, resonated with many people. News outlets shared her journey, how a woman who had been homeless, forgotten, and abandoned had clawed her way back to a life of purpose. Maggie, however, never saw herself as the central figure in this narrative. To her, the focus was always on the women she served, the women whose lives had been shattered by age, poverty, and neglect. Claire remained by Maggie's side throughout this journey, offering both professional guidance and personal support. Together they worked tirelessly to expand the foundation's reach, finding more partners, securing more funding, and building relationships with local shelters and social services. Slowly, the organization gained momentum, and Maggie's vision began to take shape. The foundation provided a safe space for women, offering not just food and shelter, but also job training, mental health services, and legal assistance. Despite her growing success, there was a quiet sadness in Maggie. She had hoped that through her efforts, Rachel and Daniel would come to see the woman she had become. She had longed for reconciliation, for a chance to rebuild the relationship she had lost with her children. But that reconciliation never came. Rachel and Daniel remained distant. Rachel, ever pragmatic, still held on to her resentment, while Daniel, despite his letter, was reluctant to move forward. The wounds were deep, and neither of them seemed ready to forgive. There were moments when Maggie felt the weight of their absence, when the empty spaces at family gatherings or in the quiet moments at home reminded her of the children she had once known and of the mistakes she had made. But in those moments, she had learned to fill that void with something else, the love and gratitude from the women she helped. It was these women whose lives she had touched in meaningful ways that made Maggie feel truly loved, appreciated, and understood. Their stories, their struggles, their triumphs, these were what mattered now. One winter afternoon, Maggie sat in her small office at the foundation, reviewing the latest reports from the outreach programs. The room was cozy, with soft light filtering through the blinds. A stack of letters from donors and beneficiaries lay on her desk, but Maggie was distracted, her thoughts lingering on the past. She had just come from a meeting with Claire where they had discussed the possibility of expanding the foundation's reach to other cities, and Maggie's mind kept wandering back to that idea. But as much as she loved the work, a part of her still felt unfulfilled. There were lingering questions that couldn't be answered, pieces of her life that remained lost to the sands of time. She thought again of her children. Would she ever see them again? Would they ever understand? As she sat there, staring out the window at the soft fall of snow, her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but Maggie picked it up anyway. Maggie Turner? The voice on the other end was clear and professional. "This is Michael Lawson, your former attorney. I have some news you might want to hear."